5 July 1945, Munich. In a cheap notebook bought with 2 eggs, Karl M. wrote a line he would not have dared to speak. The front is no longer in fields. It runs through our mouths and our files. He was 36. He had a limp that came from a warehouse fall in 1943, not from the front. He had a wife who had packed their wedding portrait in a suitcase and a son who had not come back from the Volkssturm. He had kept books for a municipal supply office during the years that devoured paper and people. His department had requisitioned coal. It had stamped permits. It had tallied shortages into neat columns that disguised panic. He looked at the street outside his building on Schwanthaler Straße. It was not a street. It was angled planes of brick, twisted rebar, and the memory of roofs. Trümmerfrauen in kerchiefs and men without sleeves passed bricks from hand to hand. They moved the city back into the realm of geometry. A wheelbarrow squeaked. Nearby, a hand-painted sign warned of unexploded ordnance a few meters ahead. The sign did not explain that everything was explosive, from tempers to dossiers. The arithmetic of rubble was simple. A load was a metric of dignity. A cleared wall was a claim on the future. The Americans had entered Munich on 30 April. They had posted notices and interpreters. They had issued curfews, 8 at night, then 10, then midnight. They had requested that all firearms be surrendered. They had collected typewriters too. They had stockpiled them for their own offices and for the cities. They had requisitioned buildings. They had requisitioned the best of what was left. They had payroll and paper. They had cigarettes. The first occupation reports from the US. Military government in Bavaria were formulaic but exact. Public order relatively intact, one entry read, though housing situation catastrophic. Hunger rising, another note said, willingness to cooperate high. There were coded lines too. Denazification hesitantly received. Evidence of elation. A woman detained brought jam to the interpreter. A laborer offered to carry crates for the military police. Everyone learned to barter tone for safety. In the apartments that survived the firestorm, families listened to an English-language radio they could not understand because it was the loudest voice. They learned to say, okay, and cigarette. Cigarettes bought bread. They bought shoes and indulgences. The arithmetic of cigarettes replaced the arithmetic of Reichsmarks. A pack of Lucky Strikes was a shorthand for a week of meat. That was the exchange rate of hunger and humiliation. On 9 May, Karl had stood by the ruins of the Justizpalast and watched a crow walk on the cornice. Berlin was a distant conflagration already turned to ash. In Munich, the fighting had not lasted long, but the silence did. It was an unsafe silence. It implied consent if you said nothing. It implied guilt if you spoke. The Allied order to watch the films of the camps came quickly. In June, he had sat in a darkened auditorium and watched Die Todesmühlen. The screen was black and white and incontrovertible. The corpses were not numbers on a requisition. They were weight and absence. He wrote afterwards in his notebook, if it was done in our name, then our name is a stain. But he did not write it with ink. He wished anyone else to see. The ink itself felt compromised. He had been a party member since 1937. It was a line that came with the job. He had joined to keep his desk. He had paid dues. He had attended rallies when attendance was marked. He had clapped with the others. He had filed the paper that made deprivation legal. He had done it because he wanted to remain with his ledgers. That was the logic. It was a logic that did not survive the spring of 1945. Its arithmetic no longer added up. 13 July 1945, Munich Police Headquarters. A line formed so long that it wrapped around the block. The line was not for ration cards. It was for the Fragebogen. The questionnaire was a dense object. 31 questions in the American version. Name, occupation, party membership, ranks, work in organizations and formations, donations, the names of your friends and your enemies, the names of those who might vouch for your soul. The sheet whispered an algebra of biography. If you considered previous associations as variables and the new order as the equation, many did not balance. He collected his form and brought it home. He put it next to his ration card. The ration card was a daily confession in the currency of calories. The questionnaire was a confession in the language of guilt. He had to fill both to eat. The front now was paper. The first post-war winter made arithmetic obscene. It is called the Hunger Winter in oral histories and occupation reports. In the official diaries of Munich, a clerk in neat hand recorded daily deliveries, potatoes, coal, flour. The numbers are small. They shrink as the cold deepens. In December 1946, the average caloric allowance in many cities in the American zone fell to around 1,000 per day for ordinary consumers. Heavy workers had more. The rest did not. Fuel shipments failed to meet targets. People took down doors for firewood. They wore their best coats to bed. In Karl's notebook, the lines become short and jagged. Hands not returned, he wrote of his son again and again, as if writing it might call him back. He learned to go to the black market. It had a location inside everyone's pocket. An Allied intelligence summary from January 1947 noted, "Trade in foodstuffs for American cigarettes continues unabated, police often complicit." The report listed prices. A kilogram of butter, 40 cigarettes. A pair of women's shoes, 60 cigarettes. The mathematics of hunger is not ambiguous. It is a ledger of losses. Every day you delay, the price goes up. He sold his silver spoons for sugar. He traded a typewriter ribbon for a shirt. He swapped a watch given to him by his father before 1914 for firewood that lasted 4 nights. He watched his wife move quietly through their circle of acquaintances, asking without appearing to ask. Pride became a ration. Guilt was not yet rationed. It was only whispered. Across the city, you could hear the voices of women in the rubble. Their work, captured in occupation photographs and later in commemorations, was the texture of the new city. Trümmerfrauen. They used hammers and hands. They stacked bricks in careful piles. They became an emblem, though not always willingly. In the Bundesarchiv, there is a sequence of images that shows women in headscarves bent at the waist, and then, the next frame, an American truck delivering bread. The images became the kind of story that hides other stories. Men absent, men in camps, men invisible, women as a symbol of perseverance rather than inquiring what alternative they had. In August 1945, denazification was a noun that promised math. It promised that guilt would be sorted into categories. It promised that a new order would be based on justice rather than fear. There were 5 classifications in the American zone: Hauptschuldige, major offenders; belastet offenders; minder belastet, lesser offenders; Mitlaufer followers; entlastet, exonerated. The Spruchkammer, the tribunals staffed partly by Germans, heard cases. The mathematics of guilt was ad hoc dressed as law. Numbers mattered. Approximately 13 million Germans filled out the Fragebogen across the zones. In the American zone, around 3.5 million cases were processed by Spruchkammern by 1949. The majority became followers. A small percentage were major or plain offenders. The qualitative truth was complicated. The quantitative truth was plain. The system needed stability more than thorough justice. The occupation required administrators who knew where the files were kept. It needed men who had sat behind the desks for the past 12 years. The math of continuity demanded experienced hands. The hands came with fingerprints. Carl filled out his questionnaire on the kitchen table while rain plucked at the tarps covering their broken windows. He read each question aloud in his head. He crossed out a line and wrote it again. He had been in the party. He had attended meetings. He had paid dues. He had never denounced anyone. He had recorded grain shipments. He wrote this down. Then he looked for a witness. He needed a Perselschein, the detergent white certificate of exoneration. A schoolteacher, evicted and bitter, signed an affidavit stating that Carl was no political person. The phrase became a bridge. People crossed it into the new Germany without changing their shoes. The hearing at the Spruchkammer took 10 minutes. The man at the table wore a tie knotted too tight. He read through the page. He stamped a copy with a blue seal. Mitläufer, he said. The word meant follower. The stamp meant more than the word. It meant employment would be possible again. It meant that the past was now a file folder, and the file folder was now his future. 7. February 1946. Munich Hauptbahnhof. Carl went to the station because new families were arriving from Silesia. They came with paper tags around their necks. The tags had names and origin and the name of the last person who had seen them alive in their village. The train yard steamed in the winter air. Brown uniforms of American MPs merged with black shawls of old women. Occupation reports called them expellees. Transport orders called them resettlers. They were all refugees. The German administration called them later the Vertriebenen. The word was a passive construction. It made people sound like leaves. Bavaria received nearly 2 million of them. Some had been driven on foot through snow. Some had crossed rivers on rafts. Some had seen things they would not see again except at night. They arrived in towns that were already crowded. In the arithmetic of rooms, an extra bed is a calculation with nothing left over. The municipal office where Carl found work in spring 1946 kept ledgers of vacant space. There were not enough lines in the ledger for the number of names. He worked at a desk again. It was a damaged desk. He could feel where a piece of shrapnel had splintered it. On the wall behind him hung a portrait of the President of the United States, because a military government officer liked to see it there, and then a portrait of the new Bavarian minister-president. Below these faces, he wrote down who could be placed where. He read petitions that were rehearsals of grief. He wrote down refusals from locals who said they could not possibly share their kitchens. He read about a man from Königsberg who had lost his hand in a threshing machine and needed a ground-floor room. He assigned him a narrow bed in a house where a widow did not want a stranger. He balanced numbers at the cost of peace. Tension was not a rumor. A police report from September 1946 noted altercations between locals and arrivals in Schwabing over use of communal washrooms. A widow was called a pig by the woman from Breslau. The woman from Breslau was called worse by a neighbor who still had her wedding china. A man who had been a soldier in the East accused the man from the East of bringing the East with him. The math of scarcity is subtractive. It subtracts patience first. Carl read entries like a priest hearing confession. He could assign beds. He could not assign reconciliation. He saw people repack their memories into the same suitcase every time they moved. He began to understand that the war had changed grammar. Subjects were now actions. Objects were now fates. The passive voice grew in utility. Things had been done. Nobody had done them. 18 kilometers southwest of Munich, at Feldafing on Lake Starnberg, there was a camp for displaced persons. Later, at Fehrenwald near Wolfratshausen, there was another camp, one of the last Jewish DP camps in the American zone. The DP camps were close enough to ride a bicycle to. Germans traded and stared. The Allied intelligence summaries called relations correct, not warm. In reports, Jewish survivors wrote about buying eggs and hearing the word swine from a shopkeeper's son. They wrote letters in Yiddish and Polish and Russian and English to families abroad. They described a Germany that did not want them, but needed their work to clear rubble and to make the numbers add up. Sometimes German civilians were brought to the camps for work details. Sometimes, as part of re-education, films were shown to them. Sometimes the notice board in the city displayed photographs of the camps, and people walked past quickly without stopping. Karl went once to the edge of a camp with a municipal delivery. He carried a folder of requests: timber, bricks, new windows for a barracks, new windows for a barracks. At the gate he saw children running with sticks and a woman who looked like a fence post wrapped in a coat. He kept his eyes on the papers. On the train back he wrote, "Saw them. They saw me. We did not speak." That was the most honest sentence he produced that summer. If there was a thesis for the years immediately after, it was this: the arithmetic of guilt was public and private. Publicly, you could say you knew nothing. Privately, you could not say that to yourself every night. People developed strategies that could be written into handbooks. They said, "We suffered too." It was not untrue. It displaced other truths. They said, "We had no choice." It was not wholly false. It hid other choices that had been made. They said, "We were only followers." It eased the way to work. It smoothed the path to a pension. It left stains on fingers that did not wash out. By 1947, the American military government grew weary of wading through biographies. They transferred responsibility for denazification to German authorities. The Spruchkammern were disassembled or absorbed. Files migrated from one shelf to another. Some were carefully annotated and kept. Some disappeared. The system of classification softened around the edges. There were amnesties for categories of offenses. There were reversals. There were quiet reappointments. The mathematics of administration reasserted itself. The budget did not pay for investigating the past. It paid for picking up the trash. He had a job in housing, then in rationing again, then in a procurement office for municipal services. He signed papers authorizing the purchase of desks and the repair of boilers. The first signs of a different country came in the form of crates with American markings, CAAT parcels, Marshall Plan shipments, new machinery on the docks with documentation in 2 languages. The word ERP appeared in minutes of meetings. The European Recovery Program was a reminder that even the new prosperity came as a ledger. In 1948, the air smelled different. The 20 June currency reform made receipts change color. Old Reichsmarks were exchanged for Deutschmarks. The old money was fit to wallpaper a room and worth less than the paste. On the 21st, shop windows filled overnight. It was not magic, it was release. Goods that had been hoarded or held back for cigarettes came out. The black market lost its oxygen. The mathematics of trust altered. New money turned into argument and hope. The new currency meant that wages mattered again. Prices became signals rather than warnings. For a clerk like Karl, the change meant that the numbers in his ledgers became a better map of the world. The new money brought new hierarchy. Those who had goods to sell were suddenly lawfully rich. Those who had nothing remained at zero but now had a way up. Inflation shrank the value of debts. It did not shrink the weight of files. Denazification files were now mostly closed. Personnel files were open. The Cold War made the past easier to fold into the present. On 24 June 1948, the Soviet blockade of Berlin began. In Munich, people followed it on the radio and in newspapers that regained thickness. The airlift was a story of tonnage, of very literal mathematics. Aircraft brought in calories. They brought coal and confidence, measured in sorties and kilograms. In the American zone, loyalty was now measured in anti-communism. The same state that had struggled to purge the past now asked the purge to fight a different enemy. The arithmetic of enemies is not neutral. It looks for old skills. It finds them in men who had them before. On 23 May 1949, the Basic Law came into force. The Federal Republic of Germany was declared. Bonn, not Berlin, was its capital. The Constitution was called provisional to leave a door open to unity. In the city, this meant that offices hung new portraits. It meant that the word democracy moved from the interpreter's lips to the clerk's. In the text, there were articles that insisted on the dignity of man and the worth of the individual. In the files, there were lists of names that had been recalculated. He moved from the municipal procurement office to a factory in 1950. The factory made machine tools. It had been damaged, then revived. Managers wore suits that fit again. The foreman who gave him his job had a thin scar and a hesitation around certain dates. The Works Council met in a quiet room with bad coffee and good intentions. The union distributed pamphlets that were earnest and spare. The directors spoke in town hall meetings about excellence and productivity. The production boards began to show gains. The first exports went out. The word Wirtschaftswunder was not yet on everyone's lips. It would be soon. It was not a miracle. It was a sum. American money, German skill, a ruined world hungry for goods, and political stability bought at the price of forgetting. The factory administration was a map of the old and the new. The main accountant had been a party member. The engineer had not. The janitor had 3 sons on the front who did not come home. The typist had a tattoo from a time when tattooing was not just fashion. Everybody had something they did not say. In a corner office, there was a man whose name had been whispered in the denazification corridors. He had been on lists. He had a Pasulschein signed by a Catholic priest who wrote that he had saved a Jewish family. The story might have been true. It might have been partly true. The mathematics of redemption is beyond arithmetic. It behaves like water in cracks. It expands where it can. Karl filed invoices and paid vendors. He helped calculate piecework wages for the men who had been prisoners of war in France and had returned with a hunger for war in France, and had returned with a hunger for work and for bread. He learned the new acronyms and the new ritual phrases: free enterprise, social partnership, Westbindung. He watched as men who had once raised their arms in a different salute now raised their hands in meetings to talk about production quotas. The pivot was clean, the floor was swept, the past checked its coat at the door. At night, at home, his wife cut out articles from the newspaper about missing persons. She took them to the Red Cross tracing office. She kept a photograph of Hans by her bed. In early 1947, a letter came from a field post handler in the East. The letter said that Hans had been seen in February 1945 on a road near Königsberg. He had been cold. He had been wearing boots too large for him. The letter did not say what had happened next. In 1949, the authorities listed him as missing, presumed dead. The stamp and the signature did not stop the waiting. The arithmetic of absence contains no solution. In schools, children learned adjectives for the period that had just ended: national, socialism. In 1952, a history book in the Bavarian curriculum spoke of the dark years. It described the suffering of the German people: bombing, displacement, hunger. It devoted half a page to the camps. It spoke in the passive. The bombs fell. The people were persecuted. The Jews were deported. The verbs were shy. The subject was missing. Karl's daughter came home with an assignment to interview her parents about the war. His wife told her about the night the sirens rang and the sky was a sheet hung with fire. He told her about ration cards. He did not tell her about the day he had written down the amount of coal to be delivered to a factory that made parts for planes. She did not ask. The assignment was turned in on time. On Sundays, the family went for walks past memorial plaques that transformed ruin into heritage. New churches blessed new altars. Priests spoke of suffering and redemption. Protestant ministers spoke of guilt, but sometimes as a general human condition rather than as a specific national crime. In speeches at Volksstrautag, the Beatles of the 50s were old men recounting dignity. In the city council, a resolution was passed to erect a monument to the bombed. A proposal for a monument to the Jewish dead stalled. The vote was close. The minutes are still available in the municipal archive. There was no villain. There were 5 absent members that day who might have made the difference. The mathematics of memory depends on quorum. Contact with survivors continued in the background of work. Some DPs left quickly, some stayed longer. Furchenwald did not close until 1957. There were American reports about German attitudes toward Jews and toward the camps. Bias softened into silence more than into contrition. An Allied intelligence summary from 1948 reads, "Population expresses fatigue toward Nazi matter. Interest in current issues, Berlin crisis, food. Attitudes toward Jews, polite in person, cold in general." A man from the bank got drunk and told a story about the inflation of 1923. He made inflation sound like a trick rather than a catastrophe. The camera took pictures of smiling men in suits and of women in dresses bought with the new currency. In the background, a man with a limp smoked a cigarette. He had been at Stalingrad. His leg hurt in the cold. He had been 19 when he went east, and 23 when he came back through a different country. 1951 brought the 131 Gesetz. Article 131 of a law that returned pensions and positions to those whose careers had been interrupted by the breakdown of the state after 1945. It was a mechanism that made the old bureaucracy new again. It was a measure that seemed administrative. It was also an amnesty by another name. It took the form of budgets and staff charts. It was democracy's bargain. Old elites in new offices. The files they had kept now kept them. Karl saw old stationery with new letterheads. He saw a man he recognized from 1942 at a desk down the hall. He saw a handshake in which both men clasped the present and pretended to let go of the past. At home, when elections came, he voted for the party that promised snugness and quiet. The Christian Democrats spoke of dignity and order. The Social Democrats spoke of justice too loudly for his taste. He wanted a democracy that did not require heroism. He had no energy left for heroism. He did what was asked of him at work. He made sure invoices were paid on time. He lived to see a refrigerator installed in their kitchen. He listened to the radio count down the years to the miracle. He watched his daughter marry a man who sold insurance and wore his hair shorter than fashion. He wrote less in his notebook. The pages record expenditures and names. There are fewer sentences like the one with which his story began. In 1955, he wrote, "Federal Republic in NATO." He wrote, "Rearmament. I do not like the word." He wrote, "They say we are normal again." He looked at the street outside. It was once again a street. It had edges and drains and shop windows with some addresses and advertisements for radios. He wondered what normal meant. He knew the arithmetic of normality: full shops, overtime, a stable currency, a government that did not ask what you had done in 1943 as long as you did not ask what it knew in 1951. He took the train to Bonn once for a conference on municipal supply and procurement. The capital looked like offices stapled to a riverbank. It was a city that was not pretending to be a capital. That had its uses. A small capital can hide what a large one cannot. He attended panels with titles that would not be out of place today. Efficiency in public spending. Ethics in administration. He listened to men talk about the difficulty of balancing needs and means. He took notes. He did not raise his hand to ask a question because he had no question that would not become a sermon. In 1958, news arrived that forced the past into the present again. A former colleague from the Municipal Ration Office was arrested on suspicion of involvement in deportations from Munich in 1942. The man had signed papers. The man had later been a minor official in a district office. He had collected signatures for a cause nobody supports in public anymore. He had been the same man all along. The newspapers wrote about complicity with a tone that felt like mathematics, with exhibits and schedules and stamps. In the factory cafeteria, someone said, "We did not know." Someone else said, "We could not have done anything." A third man said nothing and ate his soup quickly. In the files of the court, later stored in the Bavarian State Archives, there are statements from witnesses who saw names move across paper and then onto trains. They describe rooms where ink and dust and sweat mixed. They describe a clerk who did not look up when asked where the train would go. The witness said he did not answer. He looked at a ledger. The arithmetic of transport is blunt. Numbers of people and material add up to the sum of a crime. Karl did not testify. He had not known this man well. He recognized his face in the newspaper photograph. He felt the old sickness in his stomach. He wrote nothing in his notebook that week. He worked. He came home. He read the verdict in the paper. The man received a sentence that felt both too light and too heavy. He had done what was asked of him. The line that had once exonerated men now condemned them. The factory prospered. By 1960, the term Wirtschaftswunder had hardened from metaphor to story. The story was told with graphs, steel output, car production, household appliances. West Germany was the greengrocer of Europe, the machine maker, the shipbuilder. The surnames in the boardroom included a man who would sit in the chancellor's chair one day, despite the stain in his old file, a lawyer whose name would appear in footnotes to laws designed in new times with old pens. Young people learned English in school and did not spell words with old runes in their heads. An emigration of the past took place in the mind. He was not young anymore. He watched television now in the evenings. He watched the news announce the raising of walls in the east, and he thought, the front still moves, we pretend it is far away. In 1961, the Berlin Wall rose. The arithmetic of Germany split into two. One side had beer and taxes and court cases. The other side had slogans and informants and fear that felt familiar to some. In Munich, you could sip a beer at the Hofbräuhaus and speak the past in a whisper or not at all. Civic commemoration shifted slowly. In the late 1950s, a new plaque appeared on a street near his office honoring a group of local resistors who had been guillotined in 1943. Their names were read aloud by a nervous mayor. A priest intoned a prayer. There were too few people in the crowd. There were too many checks at the back of pockets for cigarettes that turned out to be pens. Silence remained a strategy. It aged well. He went sometimes to the cemetery, where there was a field for those whose bodies had not been recovered. He stood before the stones that bore only names and dates. He looked at the span between 1945 and the day's date. He did not catalogue his grief in public. He places a stone on a grave that belonged to no one he knew. The gesture was borrowed from another tradition and felt right in his hands. He read in newspapers about the re-entry of men into office whose old files were not clean. He read about Hans Globke, who had annotated laws in the years when laws became weapons, and who later became a high official in the new state. He read about Kurt Georg Kiesinger's membership in the party and his later office. He saw that the mathematics of power is recursive. It repeats patterns that have been rehearsed. He sensed that the stability he appreciated rested on bargains. He chose to be grateful for the stability and to be angry about the bargains. He could hold both feelings in one hand. He did that quietly. He kept his job. He retired in 1965. The factory gave him a watch. He smiled for a photograph. The men around him smiled too. They had known each other for 15 years without really speaking. He shook their hands. He went home and put the watch in a drawer next to the list of expenses that had kept him alive in the winter of 1946. He took out his first notebook and reread his first sentence. He found it good. It was still dangerous, which is a way to measure truth. He began to write again that summer, not every day, but enough that the notebook filled. He wrote down what he had done on certain dates and what he had not done. He wrote down the names of people whose faces he remembered at the edges of memory and whose stories he had not asked. He wrote down the smell of the DP camp, which he described as disinfectant and damp wool. He wrote down the sound of the Trümmerfrauen's hammers as the sound of an argument that could not be resolved but had to be carried forward. 13. September 1966, Munich. He wrote, "Today my daughter asked about Hans. I said his name and did not use the words missing or dead. I said your brother. She nodded. She is 50 now. She knew what I meant. Silence breeds its own lexicon." He wrote, "I walked past the new memorial stone for the synagogue that was destroyed in 1938. There were flowers there. I did not bring any. I will tomorrow." He did not say whether he went back. He read a book by Karl Jaspers, lent by a neighbor, Die Schulfrage, published in 1946. He was 20 years late. He read lines about the kinds of guilt, criminal, political, moral, metaphysical. He did not draw lines under the sentences he agreed with, but he could have. He knew he had no criminal guilt. He knew he had political guilt, in that he had been part of a state that committed crimes. He knew he had moral and perhaps metaphysical guilt because he had kept his head down when it would have been hurt to raise it. He knew he had balanced columns while his country balanced on a knife. He knew that survival had required compromise and that compromise is another word for stain. He knew he had said more than once, "We did not know," and that ignorance had been a choice sometimes when it was comfortable. He turned the pages and stopped at a sentence that said that guilt is not inherited, but responsibility is. He thought of his daughter. He thought of the school books that had taught her about suffering but not about complicity. He thought of a future in which the questions would be asked more directly. He knew he had not raised her with lies. He suspected he had not raised her with enough truth either. He was not a philosopher. He had been a clerk in a city that had made itself new over the ruins of the old. He had counted sacks of flour and reams of paper and beds. He had stamped forms with a rubber stamp on a desk that had a scar. He had learned to say the words, the time required, Mitläufer, democracy, miracle. He had not learned to say the words his conscience preferred to shout. He knew how the mathematics worked. He knew that the arithmetic of guilt had turned to the calculus of forgetting, with limits approached but never reached, functions smoothed to avoid discontinuity. He had kept his notebooks in a drawer. He had not told anyone he wrote in them. He told himself that the pages were for the day when someone would ask. Nobody asked in time. He was an ordinary man. That was the story. It was not an excuse. It was a fact. The machine runs on ordinary people. After a war, the machine that comes.